Welcome back to another video. If you haven't seen the mock-up video I posted before this one, you should check that out to see the adjustments that I made to the pattern I'm using, which is McCall 7735. Once the pattern pieces were cut out from my adjusted pattern, it was time to attach the fusible interfacing. The pattern called for this and I purchased it. But maybe if my fabric was a bit stiffer, I wouldn't have even needed to use it. I know it's definitely not historically accurate, but this being the first time trying to make a fitted garment, I thought I would just try to follow what the pattern called for. I've always had trouble getting interfacing to actually attach, no matter how much I run the iron or steam over it, so I was trying to be super thorough and initially use it without a cover cloth and then use a cover cloth and extra press it in with my iron about as hot as it could go, and still throughout the project I had issues of the interfacing pulling away and had to re-iron it down. I'm recording.
You really? No, you have to delete that. You're gonna put it in there and flame me.
In this video, I'm skipping over a lot of the assembly of the jacket because it was shown in the mock video and just seems kind of repetitive, but I'm just following the pattern instructions again for putting together the main body of the jacket. I should probably mention what fabric I'm using. This is from Burnley and Trowbridge, and it's a red worsted wool that was $20 a yard. It's lovely and lightweight and not itchy at all like some wool can be, which is just what I was looking for. For these curved seams, especially with this very thick fabric with interfacing, it probably would have been a good idea to baste in the curved seams to make sure that you don't get any puckers, but I just went very slow and carefully with my smaller stitch without basting, and it worked out okay. Starting with this part is when I basically abandoned the pattern directions because they didn't make any sense to me and just did what I thought was right. So for my first try, I pinned on the lining fabric, which is just a simple cotton muslin, onto the peplum piece, and then my plan was to flip that inside out and attach it to the jacket. But I realized after, of course, I finished stitching it all on and flipping it out that you will be able to see the underside of the peplum when you're wearing the jacket. So I have no idea why the pattern calls for you to cut out pieces in the lining fabric because it's going to show. So I just cut out the same pieces for the peplum twice in red so that the front and the back, the front piece has the interfacing, but then the back is just the red fabric. And I didn't show that here, but you'll notice that now the peplum is red on the front and the back. And then it just needed to be pleated, and the pleats were sewn in. I did fix a mistake I made when I was pleating the skirt, and I didn't put that lower level of pins down so that as you're sewing it in place, you take out the top pins, and without the bottom pins in, it can sort of get warped on the back of the fabric where you can't see how the pleats are. So I fixed that this time. For the sleeves, I did change the pattern a tiny bit and I tapered them down at the end because they were really wide. They were basically the same width at the shoulder as they were like towards the wrist. So I just tapered the sleeves down. And the next part is the cuffs. A lot of people omit the cuffs when they make this jacket, but since I only made a short sleeve shift, I thought I would just add them in. It wouldn't be hard to take them out in the future if I hated them. So that's just a simple piece of linen, which is the same linen that I made my shift out of. It's sewed into a tube and folded in half, and then that just gets stitched in. And the raw edges for this cuff will be sewed onto the lining fabric that'll go into the sleeve. So that will encase all of the raw edges, and that will be at the very end. Now this is all the pieces done. We have the bodice of the jacket, the peplum, and both sleeves ready to attach. I don't have a tremendous amount of advice for attaching sleeves, being as though I'm a huge newbie and this is like only the third time I've ever put sleeves in a arm's eye. But again, I just sort of matched up the seams I know need to touch. Like on the back of the jacket, there's a seam that goes to the top of the shoulder that needs to match up with one of the side seams of the sleeve. And I just started there and then went around the lower part of the armpit first and then made sure any of the extra fabric that needed to be gathered was all gathered along the top of the shoulder. So this was the first sleeve I set, and I did a pretty good job matching up the seams I wanted to meet in the back. You'll see that they meet up pretty good. But for some reason, when I did the second sleeve, I think I misaligned and was looking at the wrong back seam because there's two of them that go into the arm's eye, and I totally missed. And not even did I miss the seam, but I, it was bad. So I had to rip that out. One tip I will say is that when you, and I did actually do this, is sew with a really big seam, or a really big stitch the first time you put sleeves in. That way, if you mess it up, it's super easy to just rip them out. What I'm trying to show here is that I had to mess around with these pleats a lot because I enlarged the upper portion of the jacket and didn't change the length of the peplum. When it was all pleated, it didn't reach from end to end, and you need those to match up exactly with a little to spare so that you can turn in the front of the jacket to cover the raw seams. So I had to mess around with the pleats to make sure that I had enough fabric, which basically I just took those two outer pleats and made them a lot smaller and just kept adjusting until it met all the way to the fronts of the jacket. Like I said in the mock-up video, I did go ahead and use my final mock-up, which fit okay, as the lining. The patterns were the same, and this is just a cotton muslin, so I was totally fine with using that as the lining, and it saved me time and material. So what I'm doing is just rounding off the edge of the 6 boning pieces that I'm going to need. They're just little short, about 4-inch pieces that are going to go into the back seams. Instead of sewing on separate boning channels, what I decided to do instead, because I had enough seam allowance, was to turn over the raw edge and create boning channels in the seam allowance, which I've seen commonly done. A key thing to remember is to make sure the bones don't go too far down in the jacket, because that is going to be stitched over to attach the peplum, and you don't want to be sewing through your boning channels. Before attaching the lining to the jacket, I knew that there would probably be the most bulkiness around the armpit because there'll be 2 sets of seam allowances. So for the lining, I cut those pretty short. I don't think that will be an issue later, and it'll cut down on the bulk. I've never lined a garment before, and again, like I said, I had completely abandoned any pattern instructions at this point because they were confusing, nonsensical, and I couldn't be bothered. So I'm turning right sides together and my plan is to sew around the edge and leave the bottom open to flip out. But I decided to add like a sort of placket, I guess, in between the right sides of the fronts of the jacket, so that when flipped inside out, there'll be this flap that goes around to the back, so that where the ties are going to be and the eyelets, you won't see the white lining on the inside. It'll just all be the red wool. I had made double, triple sure that I wasn't going to be sewing anything to the wrong sides, but that would be something so classic that I would do, that I was so happy when I flipped it right side out and everything was where it was supposed to be. Look at that!
What do you do with this down here and all this stuff?
That is going to be, so this is going to go like this. And then once I get that on, then I will attach this boy. Once I pinned down those plackets around to the back to the lining, I needed to sew in boning channels for the two longer bones that will go on either side of the front to stop from puckering in between where the cording is going to go through the eyelets. I did fittings throughout, but here's a picture of me checking the waist length before deciding how far up on the bodice I should sew the peplum. I decided that I wanted to take out a little bit of length. I know I lengthened it in the pattern, so I probably took back out an inch that I added, but whatever. And in order to keep the lining from not going where I don't want it, I am pinning it just to make sure that the lining doesn't accidentally get like sewed in farther into the peplum than the outside and sort of create bulge on the outside of the jacket. I don't know if that made any sense, but that's why I was pinning it. And then I pinned on the peplum, matching up the back seam with the back pleat, and pinned it in place all the way around. I really should have done this by hand. This like 8 layers of wool and interfacing and lining, sewing this on over the pleats. My sewing machine was very unhappy with me, and I did ultimately end up breaking it.
This is rough.
Everything was going fine until I decided to re-stitch some on the end to reinforce, and that is when my needle just got completely stuck. Never had that happen before. The only way I was able to get the needle out was I was trying to toggle it back up, but I don't know, something was stuck. So The only thing I could think of to do was just to take off the foot. And, oh, I'm using a walking foot, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned before, but just because there's so many layers here, I just pulled out the walking foot again because I have it. And that helps move the top of the fabric and the bottom at the same time when you have like really thick multiple layers. And once I got the foot off, I then was able to loosen the needle, and that loosened whatever had gotten stuck, and I was finally able to get the jacket out of there. But my machine's been kind of making a funny noise since this, and I probably definitely need to take it in. But I don't know how to do that. But I'll figure it out. I don't think anything's super broken. I think maybe something just got bent. These last finishing parts were all done by hand. I basically whipped in the side placket, and then I turned over the edges of the jacket along the bottom and whipped those in place as well to hide those raw edges. Here's some photos of it after that process. It's hard to know if it's gonna fit okay without the eyelets being there to cinch them in, but I basically realized I needed to shorten the sleeves. So I did that. I shortened the sleeves a little bit after I made a poll on Instagram. And I'm going to do spiral lacing for this. So to sort of judge where to put the eyelets, I pulled the stomacher pattern out that I hadn't messed with yet and just drew on my spiral lacing pattern just like my stays and sewed those eyelets in with some silk red thread. And oops, I sewed the eyelets way too high. So what I did was took all the layers that I sewed the eyelets through and made a test patch, sewed an eyelet, and then cut it out to see if the fabric would heal itself because I used an awl, which thankfully it did, and my experiment worked. So here I am cutting out the extra eyelets that I didn't need. I wanted to try this on with a stomacher, and I hadn't messed with this yet, and I knew I was going to embroider one fancy later, but as a stand-in, I had extra fabric that I was going to use, so I just took my stomacher piece, and I realized it wasn't symmetrical, which is dumb, and I'm not going to add the snaps that the pattern has, so I just cut off the unsymmetrical part and recut out my pattern. And I also added seam allowance because I thought it was a little small, so I added about a 1/2 inch to all the sides. I just cut out little tabs, sewed it together, flipped it inside out, and then I will be adding bones to this next once it's all ironed out. Once the bones were put in, I basically I put them all in from the bottom, and then I just sewed the bottom closed to hold the bones in place, and there we go, a stand-in stomacher so I could try on the jacket. You'll notice here in these pictures the upper eyelets are still there. I fixed that later, but overall, I'm super happy with how this jacket turned out, especially now that I fixed the eyelets. I think the fit is okay, could be better, but as my first fitted garment, I say heck yeah. I think it looks great. So thanks so much for watching, and take a look at my other videos if you haven't seen them.